June 6, 1944. 5 a.m. Crisp Battery, Normandy shoreline. The binoculars shook faintly as Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen scanned the horizon, imprinting in his mind an image that would haunt him for the remainder of his years. In the dim gray of pre-dawn, he saw a sight that defied every assurance received from senior command. The English Channel, which had guarded the western border of the Third Reich, had become a pathway of steel, a non-stop procession of ships spanning from one edge of the horizon to the other, their shadowy outlines blending into a single, unbroken wave of impending catastrophe. The attacking armada included 6,939 ships, with 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing vessels, 736 support ships, and 864 merchant vessels, all crewed by over 195,000 sailors from 8 different Allied nations. At precisely 5:52 a.m., an order reached Ohmsen's battery to commence firing. Then, 3 minutes after at 5:55 a.m., the initial salvos from his 210mm Czech-made Škoda artillery soared toward the invading ships. It was like drops of water thrown against an incoming tidal wave. His unit opened fire on U.S. cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy as well as the battleship USS Nevada. At 6:30 a.m., his guns would score a hit on the destroyer USS Corey, which would become the only U.S. destroyer to be lost on D-Day. Standing in his fortified concrete observation station atop the Crisbecq battery, the 32-year-old officer in the Navy had just become Fortress Europe's first German defender to spot and engage the Allied landing. What Ohm observed through his Zeiss optics that dawn surpassed an invasion fleet. It represented the concrete proof of industrial power that Nazi information campaigns had claimed was impossible. The certainty of defeat was now advancing toward him at 8 knots. The change had started. Within several hours, German officers all over Normandy would see firsthand an exhibition of Allied production strength that would crush every belief they had about Allied capabilities and herald the onset of the downfall of Hitler's supposed thousand-year empire. The night of June 5 had brought many troubling warnings. At Army Group B's staff headquarters in Laros-Guyong, 50 miles from shore, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, who had been Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's chief of staff since April 15, 1944, was tracking more alarming updates. Rommel was away in Germany, observing his spouse's birthday, persuaded that weather conditions would deter any attack. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army received word that large parachute operations were being carried out over Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, with a combined force of more than 13,000, were being transported by Douglas C-47 Skytrains. General Deer Artillery Erich Marx, who commanded the 84th Corps from his base in St. Lau, grasped the situation without hesitation. A seasoned leader from the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx had developed a sharp tactical sense from years of war. Even so, Marx, among the Wehrmacht's most seasoned leaders, could not grasp the magnitude of the approaching danger. The Germans had readied themselves for a seaborne assault. They had not foreseen being overwhelmed by an avalanche of materials and machinery. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, assigned as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, had devoted months to evaluating shoreline defenses. With naval roots dating to his 1894 birth, Ruge had greater knowledge of naval operations than any other German officer in France. He had requested increased numbers of mines, more barriers, and more artillery. Nevertheless, as he would later note in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, we were equipping ourselves for the previous war. They were preparing for the coming one. The German leadership had persuaded itself that the Allies might launch a landing using perhaps 20 divisions backed by approximately 3,000 ships. These projections were based on their own strengths, deficiencies, and wartime difficulties as resources dwindled. After 5 years of combat, when dawn slowly illuminated the Normandy coast on June 6, German spotters in their bunkers and observation posts stretching from Cherbourg to Le Havre started relaying reports of what they deemed impossible. It was not just hundreds of craft, but in fact thousands. Not simply a diversion or mock attack, but the largest coordinated amphibious assault in the annals of humanity. At defensive position WN-62, which had a vantage point over what would become Omaha Beach, Gerrit Heinrich Severloh looked through his machine gun's embrasure at 5:45 a.m. The 20-year-old agricultural worker from Metzing had never laid eyes on the sea until posted in Normandy. Now, all he could see was metal, not water. Vessels in every direction, Severloh would later record in his autobiography. Large ships, tiny vessels, broad, flat-bottomed crafts, and destroyers darting around like sheepdogs. The skyline had disappeared. I tried enumerating them, but lost count at 100. There were literally thousands. All along the 50-mile-wide invasion zone, German officials and troops felt the same breathtaking shock. What confronted them was not merely a numerical superiority, but an altogether different scale. At 5:30 a.m., a naval bombardment began. The fleet comprised 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. For the Germans, this marked their introduction to the concept of American industrial arithmetic. USS Texas by itself discharged 255 shells from its 14-inch guns during the opening hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In just 1 hour, a single vessel had unleashed 178 tons of explosives, surpassing the entire munitions reserve of many German artillery units. Before any of the troops landed on the shores, Allied naval guns had fired around 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships, totaling almost 130,000 tons of explosives. General der Infanterie Gab Blumenried, staff chief to the Commander-in-Chief West, would later recall, "We had trained to fight soldiers. Instead, we fought factories." At 6 a.m., as naval shells still pounded the Atlantic defenses, the Germans encountered the second example of Allied industrial dominance. The air was filled with planes, not mere dozens or hundreds but thousands. Allied air crews executed over 14,000 missions in support of the beach assaults, having already achieved air dominance before the invasion itself. The Luftwaffe had around 300 usable planes throughout France. On D-Day, they managed 319 missions. The Allies completed 14,674. There were 46 Allied planes for every German aircraft in the sky. The calculation wasn't just unfavorable, it was preposterous. Major Isep Prill, leading Jagdgeschwader 26, carried out the only Luftwaffe strike on the landing beaches that daybreak. Accompanied by his wingman, Heinz Bodaschik, he made a single strafing run at Sword Beach before withdrawing from dozens of Allied fighters. This well-documented episode, noted in several historical records, highlighted the utter impotence of German air strength. Despite the overwhelming opposition, some German units initially believed they could maintain their lines. On Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division held superior defensive ground on high terrain overlooking the sand. Concrete bunkers equipped with machine guns created intersecting fields of fire. The first American infantrymen from the 1st and 29th Divisions entered a massacre. Right when the Americans landed at 6:30 a.m., gunfire from the fortified nests commenced. Heinrich Severloh, operating an MG-42 at Weiterstand's Nest 62, unleashed over 12,000 shots that morning, as confirmed by his own statements. He watched as American troops dropped by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Corpses drifted in the water. The sand was stained crimson. Briefly, it seemed possible the Atlantic Wall might withstand the attack. Then came the destroyers. Around 8 a.m., with the crisis at Omaha peaking and General Omar Bradley contemplating pulling out, something extraordinary took place. U.S. destroyers, disregarding the hazards of sandbars or mines, pushed into only 1,000 yards from shore, close enough for direct fire. The USS Monarch, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt aimed their 5-inch guns at specific German fortifications. At that short range, they could not fail to hit. This engagement, extensively recorded in naval logs, proved pivotal in shattering the German resistance at Omaha. At that moment, German command began to grasp what American industrial capacity truly meant. It wasn't only a matter of ship numbers. It was the readiness to hazard them, expend them as tools. The destroyer USS Corrie was lost, yet replacements immediately filled the gap. For the Kriegsmarine, ships were invaluable, non-replaceable resources. For America, they were instruments, of which there were thousands more. As the hours went on, German watchers saw a spectacle beyond all expectations for an amphibious operation. The landing craft appeared ceaselessly, one surge after another, endlessly. A steady, mechanical flow of troops and equipment moved from the sea onto land. The sheer range of purpose-built vessels amazed German onlookers. Landing craft tanks, LCTs, brought 30-ton Sherman tanks right onto the sand. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, gigantic ships 328 feet long beached themselves and lowered bow doors to offload whole tank units. DUKW amphibious trucks swam in from the sea, crossed the shore, and directly supplied fighting troops. By the close of the day, the Allied forces had come ashore with about 156,000 troops, comprising 132,715 by sea and 23,400 by parachute. This contingent surpassed the whole German 7th Army holding Normandy. During the first day, Allied records show they landed 156,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of materiel. The German 7th Army, defending all of Normandy, had less than 500 functioning tanks. On the first day alone, the Allies landed triple that number. The German counteraction to the invasion exposed not only a lack of equipment but also a collapse of systems in the face of overwhelming enemy strength. The renowned Panzer divisions, responsible for conquering France in 6 weeks during 1940, were immobilized due to the Allies' dominance in the air and by naval artillery. The 21st Panzer Division, the sole armored force close enough to act on D-Day, initiated its counterstrike at 4 p.m. It required the division 3 complete hours to traverse the 10 miles from Ranville, arriving in and moving through Caen. Instead of being a forceful armored assault, it turned into a sorrowful line of destroyed tanks. After the surviving panzers finally confronted British troops by Sword Beach, they faced naval gunfire directed by advanced spotters. HMS Warspite, stationed 15 miles off the coast, delivered 15-inch shells capable of piercing any existing tank's armor. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, leader of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later record in his memoirs, "The material advantage of the enemy was so overwhelming that our own strength was swept away as easily as a wave crashing against rocks." On June 7, the day after D-Day, German reconnaissance aircraft returned images that high-ranking officers at first refused to accept. The Allies were creating harbors rather than seizing ports, constructing them out of nothing on the open water. The Mulberry harbors demonstrated an industrial prowess of scarcely believable scale. These artificial ports, pre-built in Britain, totaled 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 piers, 10 miles of floating roads, and 93 ships deliberately scuttled as breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, the Mulberry harbors were bringing in 9,000 tons of materiel each day, surpassing the capacity of numerous French ports. The Germans had spent 4 years constructing the Atlantic Wall to safeguard those very ports. Meanwhile, the Allies had simply rendered ports unnecessary. Throughout June 1944, German leaders began to perceive the totality of their intelligence shortcomings. The complex ruse known as Operation Fortitude had persuaded German intelligence that Normandy was merely a diversion. They believed the real assault would take place at Pas de Calais, headed by the fictitious army group supposedly commanded by Patton. For vital weeks, German strategic reserves stayed immobilized, awaiting an invasion that never materialized. General der Panzertruppe Leo von Schweppenberg, who commanded Panzer Group West, uncovered the subterfuge after captured papers disclosed that Patton was actually in Normandy, in command of the very real Third Army. As June gave way to July, reports from German officers to upper command grew increasingly despairing. Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander-in-chief West, received a call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at the OKW, who demanded to know why the Allied landings had not been repulsed. When Keitel inquired about the proper course of action, Rundstedt replied with his famous statement, "Make peace, you fools. What else can be done?" This forthrightness caused Rundstedt to be immediately dismissed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler on June 17 at Margeville, France. As chronicled in official records, Rommel presented figures highlighting Germany's hopeless position. Total Allied air dominance, divisions at only 30% strength, and an inability to move by day because of naval gunfire. Hitler responded by issuing a strict order forbidding retreat and insisted on fanatical resistance. Rommel left the meeting knowing Germany's fate was sealed. In less than a month, Rommel would be named in the July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler and compelled to end his own life. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff who survived the war, would later recall in Invasion 1944. Rommel and the Normandy campaign. That defeat was not due to better soldiers or superior tactics but because we were buried under an avalanche of equipment. The fighting for Caen showed the impossibility of German resistance to Allied material dominance. On July 7, 467 heavy bombers of the RAF dropped 2,500 tons of explosives on Caen within 40 minutes, an amount of destructive force exceeding all that the Luftwaffe had in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, considered among Germany's elite units, fielded 20,540 troops and 150 tanks at the start of the campaign. After 6 weeks, only 300 remained, with no tanks at all, a loss of 8,000 men in the Falaise Pocket alone. Operation Cobra, the American push to escape Normandy beginning July 25, displayed Allied superiority conclusively. There were 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 mediums, and 550 fighter bombers dropping 3,300 tons of bombs in an area only 6,000 by 2,200 yards. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Division was directly under the bombardment, reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting another army, but an industrial complex." The Panzer Lehr Division, which entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 troops, simply disappeared. Out of 3,000 troops in the impacted area, 1,000 were killed instantly, another 1,000 wounded, and the last 1,000 were so traumatized they were unable to continue fighting. Friendly fire during this operation sadly claimed the lives of 111 Americans and wounded 490, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer to die in combat in Europe. Nevertheless, the operation absorbed these losses without affecting its success. From August 12 to 21, 1944, the Falaise Pocket turned into the final resting place for German troops in Normandy. The assessed figures were catastrophic: 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 taken prisoner, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed just in the northern part, and 2,447 non-armored vehicles abandoned. A total of 252 artillery guns were lost. Although between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans escaped the encirclement, they did so as scattered remnants and not organized battle units. The German High Command struggled to grasp they were confronting not simply a military opponent, but an industrial powerhouse. The production comparison in 1944 vividly demonstrated the overwhelming industrial power of the Allies. German figures from 1944 show aircraft production at 39,87, tanks reaching a monthly high of 1,854 in December, and military truck output at 68,000. In contrast, American production in 1944 resulted in 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 military trucks. These numbers did not factor in the contributions of Britain, Canada, or the Soviet Union. Germany was pitted against the combined industrial output of the world, relying only on the manufacturing strength of a medium-sized nation that was increasingly diminished by bombing raids. The United States' total wartime output amounted to 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 pieces of artillery, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, who once served as Chief of the General Staff, assessed after the conflict that by 1944, the Allied lead in production capabilities had reached roughly 5-to-1. In particular sectors, such as truck production, this ratio was 10-to-1. Our loss was not due to defeat alone. It was a matter of numbers. The German officers who survived Normandy underwent profound psychological changes. They were confronted with not only a military loss, but also the total undermining of Nazi doctrines regarding German preeminence and assumed American frailty. Young officers, who had been educated under Nazism, felt the impact most strongly. They had always been told that Americans lacked toughness, were coddled by comfort, and incapable of real fighting. Yet instead, they encountered Americans equipped with machinery for labor, radios for coordination, plentiful ammunition for continual training, and the assurance that came from endless resources. The suicide rate among German officers experienced a steep rise. Suffering defeat was one matter. Facing the total negation of their entire belief system was another. More than just massive numbers, German officers also faced a technological disparity that revealed Germany's lag. Proximity fuses transformed anti-aircraft efforts into accurate killers. Radar targeting enabled naval gunfire to strike targets located miles inland with a first shot. DUKW amphibious trucks handled supply challenges on a level Germans had not even considered. German officers were particularly struck by Allied employment of specialized vehicles. Hobart's Funny's specially adapted tanks capable of mine clearing, bridge laying, and bunker destruction overcame tactical obstacles through engineering, not just by spending lives. During the Normandy campaign, German officers came to especially fear naval gunfire. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns were able to launch 24, 48-pound shells 23 miles inland. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite used their main batteries as super-heavy artillery, able to demolish any objective. German artillery attempting to return fire against ships found the effort hopeless. Ships would move and they would also return fire with force. By July 1944, it had become nearly impossible for German forces to move in daylight. Allied fighter bombers, waiting in queues and guided by forward controllers, could strike any identified target within minutes. The numbers told their own tale. Enemy aircraft in the theater exceeded 12,000. German numbers were between 300 and 500. Allies flew 5,000 to 8,000 sorties per day. Germans managed 50 to 100, circumstances permitting. The ultimate numbers emerging from the Normandy operation illustrated the triumph of industrial-scale warfare. From June 6 to August 30, 1944, 52,299 personnel were landed, 438,471 vehicles were brought ashore, and supplies totaling 98,259 tons were delivered. There were over 480,000 aircraft sorties. German losses in Normandy included 240,000 killed, 200,000 taken prisoner, the loss of 2,200 tanks and assault guns, and the destruction of over 40 divisions. In 1954, a decade after D-Day, surviving German officers convened in Bonn for a private symposium to discuss the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, presented the keynote address. He stated that Normandy had taught them war itself had fundamentally changed. It had ceased being simply a clash between opposing armies, instead becoming a contest between economic systems. While German strategy counted divisions, Allied efforts counted factories. Where German valor was measured, the Allies tallied production. The memory that persisted for him was watching American bulldozers clear destroyed German tanks to make way for their supply trucks. German officers who had been present at D-Day were forever transformed. Hans Speidel would later serve as a NATO general, aiding in bringing West Germany into the Western Defense Alliance. Numerous Normandy veterans later promoted European economic unity, understanding that only by sharing their resources could Europe potentially balance U.S. industrial power. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who led German troops in Italy, compared his situation with that of the Normandy front. In Italy, they could confront the Allies almost as equals. On the open terrain of Normandy, where the Allies deployed their full industrial strength, the German forces were simply wiped out. On June 6, 1984, marking the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned as a guest of honor to Crisbecq Battery. Once an Oberleutnant zur See and now 73, he stood in the same spot where he had first observed the invasion fleet. Addressing assembled veterans, both Allied and German, he recalled, 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the unthinkable, a sea of ships stretching from one horizon to the other. In that instant, everything I had believed was proven false. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not plan and execute such invasions. I fired my guns at that fleet, but it was as pointless as tossing stones against the tide. We managed to sink a single destroyer and damage a few more, but for every ship we hit, 100 more passed unharmed. Young officers today analyze Normandy tactics, but the true lesson is much clearer. In contemporary warfare, the side capable of the highest output is victorious. We came to realize that in war, industrial strength equals military strength. The vast armada I saw that morning was not just an invading force, it was American industrial ability made visible. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied vessels approach on D-Day saw more than a landing, they saw the dawn of a new kind of war, in which industrial output would surpass all else. That memory, the endless stream of Allied ships, became the tangible sign of democracy's latent power set free, and of industrial might wielded for military ends on a scale that rendered conventional military virtues obsolete. They had prepared themselves for classic warfare, but what they encountered was the full production capacity of the United States. Those Germans observing the Armada recognized with terrifying clarity that they were witnessing not only the end of conventional war as they had known it, but the beginning of something different, a conflict where industrial power rendered their expertise obsolete. Their downfall was industrial, not tactical, numerical, not martial. Their courage did not fail them, but rather, their supply of trucks did. This was inscribed in steel across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, where nearly 7,000 vessels proclaimed the arrival of U.S. industrial power in Europe, marking a transformation from which there was no turning back.